thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and to learn all about these different perspectives on megacities and megaregions and so forth. My own experience, of course, has been focused on the United States, and but we've been very interested in learning from precedents elsewhere in North America and Europe and in China in particular. I've been asked to talk about the question of social equity in megaregions and strategies to make these places more equitable than they tend to be on their own. Start with some definitions. Apologize for all the words in the slides. I'm violating all the rules that I give my students, but we've defined them at Regional Plan in America 2050 as networks of metropolitan regions that have shared economies and natural resource systems, shared histories and culture, and that stretch over several hundred kilometers in extent, and which makes them too large to be easily accessible by automobile and too small to be readily accessible by commercial aviation. They have the potential, which then has to be realized, of offering larger labor and housing markets and agglomeration economies. But very often these opportunities are impeded by out-of-date and congested transportation links, and particularly in our country where we've been negligent in updating these transportation systems. We've been working on this concept of high-performance rail as a kind of a improvement on high-speed rail, and the notion is to create higher speed rail systems that can be designed around the needs of megaregions functioning to serve both large and small cities within megaregions, and not necessarily just providing long-distance, high-speed intercity services. And I'll talk some more about that. Back in 2004, I ran a project at the University of Pennsylvania that led to the creation of America 2050, where we identified, I think it was the same kind of discovery that Jean Gottman had in looking at the Northeast, and we said, by golly, there are 11 of these things emerging across the United States. We did this project, and it really started with a studio meeting hosted by Sir Peter Hall at University College London. Armando Carbonell from Lincoln Institute was there, and Lincoln's been a really important player in promoting and developing this concept. So we've had kind of an exploration now over a decade or longer into how these places function and what we can do to essentially to make them more functional, but also to make them more equitable. These are important places in our country. They represent about 70% of the current population, and in the future an even larger share of both population and GDP. The vast majority of immigrants coming to our country end up being attracted to these places because of their economic opportunities and quality of life. And so in many ways they're going to become the crucible in which we create a new kind of a diverse society. And we're not quite in the same league that Merritt Gertler described for Toronto, but many of our cities, places like New York, a third or more of the population of these places are not native born. They contain most of the anchor institutions that Merrick was talking about as well, the research universities, teaching hospitals, corporate and government research labs that drive innovation and that attract talent from around the world. But we keep running into this problem that they lack the mobility systems and governance systems. Going back to Anthony's comments about governance, and this seems to be a universal problem, that there are not many good models for governing these large networks of metropolitan areas that are needed to unlock their economic potential. Again, not just an American or North American phenomenon. These places are emerging, I think 10 or 11 of them in China, 8 in Europe, places like the Pearl River Delta and the Jing-Jin-Ji region here in the capital region around Beijing. In the U.S., and I think in most places we're finding that the existing classic rail systems and mid-20th century or late 20th century highway systems, the commercial aviation systems, in our case the airspace as well as the runways and the airports themselves are all congested, they're at crush loads and so forth, and so we need to find new modes of transportation, and the most logical one I think in all of these places is rail, and then the question is how do you design rail to serve the needs of these places that include a number of both large and small cities and metropolitan regions. So looking towards solutions, we're pushing this idea at Penn and at RPA of high-performance rail in much the same way that limited access highways enabled the creation of metropolitan economies. We believe that high-performance rail can enable the creation of this new economic geography and mega-region scale economies. So most of the world is building these things. China's got the largest system, but we did some work in a Penn studio in the Jing-Jin-Ji region last year, which discovered that the system really doesn't meet the needs of the mega region, the intercity high-speed rail system, and doesn't fit well with the metro system or regional rail, or existing commuter rail, and there's a missing link that needs to be filled with a new kind of high-performance regional rail system. We've been lagging behind the rest of the world in building these systems, but we're beginning to make some progress in places like California and the Northeast. The principal focus, and again going back to the equity issue that I've been asked to talk about, the principal focus of public policy research in the States has been on inequities between cities, or within cities rather, and within metropolitan regions. And there are equally wide gaps between the performance of regions. We did some work at America 2050, again with a lot of input from Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, looking at underperforming regions across the country, and most of these places are outside of the mega regions. Although one of our mega regions, the Great Lakes region, is our Great Rust Belt. It's our great work in progress, rebuilding that. But within the mega regions, we're also finding that there are very large and in some cases growing social and economic divisions. We've been focusing on mega regions around the world, but our major focus has been in the Northeast, where we're located in Philadelphia. And the Northeast is the region, of course, that Jean Gottman is megalopolis that he discovered back in the 1960s. And we're now working on an economic development strategy for the northern end of the Northeast mega region in southern New England, the stretch of the Northeast between New York and Boston, which includes more than a dozen mid-sized former industrial cities, manufacturing centers that have never recovered from the loss of manufacturing. So again, the Northeast mega region, everyone outside of the Northeast knows New York and Washington and Boston, and as well as Philadelphia and Baltimore. These are the engines of the Northeastern economy. Three of these places, New York and Boston and DC, have all done remarkably well over the last 3 or 4 decades. They were all in trouble in the 1970s. New York, I used to have I called it my Death of New York bookshelf, with a collection of books that, that were titled The Death of New York, The End of New York, The Decline of New York. You all remember Blade Runner. We had movies, I think there were Broadway shows about the decline of New York and so forth. The Robert Moses book, Bob Caro's book was, Power Broker. The subtitle was Robert Moses and the Decline of New York, written in the late 70s. And when everybody had given New York as being bankrupt and ungovernable, when I started working early in my career in Boston at the Boston Redevelopment Authority in the early 1970s, Fortune magazine came out with a list of America's death watch cities, and Boston was on the list with Cleveland and St. Louis. And Oakland and Newark and so forth. Who could believe this now? Because these places have come bouncing back, and I've got a punch list here of the things that have gone right. Really good, strong government, local government leadership, good, strong mayors, engaged civic and business leaders, emergence of the new economy, IT and biotech and so forth, lowered rates of crime and homelessness, investments in transit. We've put $120 billion into our transit system in the New York region, and it's been transformational for New York. The 90% of the new job creation in the New York metropolitan region over the last 20 years has been within New York City and not in the suburbs. A dramatic change from previous experience. Immigration from abroad, which has again rejuvenated all of these cities. The changing locational preferences of millennials and seniors. They want to be in cities, they want to use transit and so forth. The growth of eds and meds, the anchor institutions. And in the case of Boston and New York, and in New York, strong state government support, and in DC, the federal government, of course, is headquartered there and has been growing its payroll and its spending in the DC metropolitan area. But they're all now choking on congestion and rising rents, which is going to make it tough to continue this, this success. And they all have the disadvantages of being in the most congested, expensive place in North America, and they don't have all of the advantages and synergies from being in this crowded place, or synergies with the nearby metros. And two of our big cities, Philadelphia and Baltimore, have had a tougher time coming back, although they seem to have turned the corner. Certainly Philly, Baltimore's had a lot of problems even recently with the racial unrest and so forth. There's a lot of work to be done in those two cities, and we believe that by strengthening the infrastructure connections, the physical connections between all of these cities, that Philly and Baltimore will also begin to experience the kind of recoveries that New York and Boston and DC have had. Now that leaves the second-tier cities, these older manufacturing centers that are nearly all of them are in real trouble, the ones that are outside of the immediate orbit of New York or Boston or DC. So places like Stamford, Connecticut, 50 kilometers from New York City, done very well because of its strong rail connections to New York, White Plains, other regional centers right in the immediate orbit of New York City. Same is true to some extent about Providence, Rhode Island, near Boston. But the places that are a little farther away, that are just outside of the metro orbits of these big successful places, they are in trouble and deteriorating. And so we believe that a broad set of strategies, of public investment and public policy strategies, are needed to solve this problem of growing inequity between these highly successful big world cities like New York and Boston and DC and these underperforming mid-sized cities. We believe that high-speed or high-performance rail is necessary but not sufficient. And by the way, the difference between high-speed rail and high-performance is the notion of taking the capacity of each of these rail lines, and instead of just running 1 or 2 or 3 intercity trains, we're running a dozen trains that serve a whole range of markets within the mega regions and that provide higher speed service connecting both large and small cities in the mega regions. So it's necessary but not sufficient, and it has to be accompanied by other policies to transform the economy of these smaller places. It's very clear that job training for displaced workers who've been left behind by the loss of manufacturing jobs, that job training for those displaced workers has got to be at the top of the list. Focusing on urban amenities that make these second-tier cities, which may have teaching hospitals or universities and so forth, making them sticky places where the graduates want to stick around and where they can also become magnets for immigrants. Improving schools and local transit, the basic public services and so forth, which is difficult to do given the limited tax base in many of these places. And then finally, again, focusing on the research universities and the other anchor institutions that can attract talent and create an innovation pipeline. In our work in New England, in the north end of the Northeast Megaregion, we've been very interested in learning from the Northern Powerhouse project in the United Kingdom, which is about a 2-year-old initiative now, but it's built on HS2, the high-speed rail link between London and Birmingham. In the typical British fashion, they made the decision to go ahead and build HS2, and then somebody said, well, as long as we're doing that, maybe we ought to have there was really Sir Howard Bernstein, the city manager of Manchester, who said, well, as long as we're spending 50 billion, or it was about 36 billion pounds, why don't we build an economic development strategy around that? And they're now doing it, and sounds like the kind of approach that we would take in our country, but they're doing it and they're moving ahead with it. And I had a team of students and faculty in Manchester and the rest of the Northern Powerhouse region in the north of England last month, and very interesting to see the innovations that they're now pursuing with the Northern Powerhouse initiative. So it began with these high-performance rail links between London and the north, but now they're building high-performance rail links between Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, and Sheffield, the 4 major cities in the north. And again, with the idea of creating agglomeration economies between these places they're only 30 or 40 miles apart from each other, but they're all connected by the oldest railroads in the world. It takes an hour and a half or something to get from Liverpool to Leeds, and they'll be cutting those travel times by more than half. Governance reforms. That all 4 of the major cities now have, for the first time, have directly elected mayors. They have strong mayors for the first time, and they all have combined authorities that are essentially strategic planning authorities like the Greater London Authority, again incentivized by central government devolution of responsibilities. These places, all of these cities have moved ahead with these governance innovations. They've established a new strategic planning entity for transportation called Transport for the North, again mirroring the success of Transport for London in the southeast that has had such success in rebuilding the transportation network around Greater London to plan and finance major transport investments. A set of urban amenity strategies led by the cities but supported by national government for amenity, housing, and public spaces, public realm improvements. Education reform, reforms of primary and secondary education, but again a focus on adult education for displaced workers, which seems to be a predicate for success in transforming the economic future of these places. And finally, a really big investment in research universities and teaching hospitals, and then the conscious effort to create technology transfer procedures and institutions so that the technologies that developed in these places is applied in these cities. The most visible thing is the transformation of these rail links, and in some cases road links, to replace these archaic transportation links with modern high performance rail systems and improved motorways and so forth. So we're now looking at how to create a similar strategy for the northern half of the Northeast Megaregion in southern New England between New York and Boston, with the goal of revitalizing the region's mid-sized cities. And again, there are about a dozen of these older manufacturing centers that have been in decline for 40 years. And I think one of the things that I've been telling people is that it's probably going to take about that long to, oh, thank you. There we go. Perfect. All right. That it's taken 4 decades for these places to decline. It's probably going to take something like that to bring them back. So as in the Northern Powerhouse, no simple solutions. I always wanted to create a bumper sticker that would say simple solutions to complex problems, right? Is sort of what the politicians like to tell us, but we don't have them. And so, I think that in our country and in Britain, there's I think a real impetus to do this, given the politics of Brexit, the politics of Mr. Trump. Whatever happens next week, there are a lot of people voting for him because their cities and regions have been left out of the new economy that most of us are a part of. And right-wing politicians across the industrialized world are essentially these politics are being driven by places that have been very hard hit by globalization, and their needs have been forgotten by central governments. So I think, once again, there's a reason to do this, and that is that by bringing back places like Providence and Hartford and Springfield, places that used to be the engines of the U.S. economy, the national economy, and could be again, that there are real opportunities and I think one of the things driving the Northern Powerhouse is the sense that the British economy isn't going to succeed globally if it's running on 3 cylinders. It really needs to have the North, and the same thing is true in our cities in southern New England. And again, this resurgence will also help the big metros like New York and Boston, which are choking on congestion and rising residential and commercial rents. Again, achieving these goals is going to require new levels of investment and coordination. We're looking at some creative financing strategies that really are designed to capture a very small part of the increase in economic activity in these places and use them to make these investments. Again, similar challenges facing China's mega regions. We did a project in Jingjiangji here in Beijing last year, looking at least the outlines of a mega region scale reclamation strategy for the environment, transportation strategy, economic development strategy, quality of life strategy. And all of these issues face this region. You know, Beijing and Tianjin are choking on congestion and pollution and rising rents, while the second-tier cities and rural villages are left out of the mega regions' growing prosperity. And it's a real problem because I think we estimated that something like 10 million people in this mega region are going to be moving from rural communities into the big cities unless strong efforts are made to improve economic opportunity and quality of life in these smaller places. We outlined a regional rail network, again, high-performance regional rail network that would fill the missing link between high-speed and intercity rail, which China has been so successful at building, and then the existing commuter rail and metro systems that would be designed to underpin a regional equity strategy so that second-tier cities like Baoding and others could in fact get a larger share of the region's prosperity. So as in the US and the UK, this needs to be complemented, you know, the investments in infrastructure need to be complemented by these other policies. The new governance institutions needed to plan, finance, and build the networks, and additional investments in urban amenity and job skills and anchor institutions in these second-tier cities with advantages for all. In every country, in ours and in China and other countries, you know, these equity strategies are going to require a new focus on this issue that really hasn't gotten much attention in our country, at least, or in many other places. And it's going to require a long-term commitment, the kind of thing that we're not very good at in our country. And I'm eager to hear from the other participants in the panel later on as to whether we can sustain, or whether you've been able to sustain public policies over a very long period. You know, 5- and 10-year plans are fine, but we're talking about, you know, a 40-year plan to address these issues. Again, thank you for the opportunity to be here. Look forward to the conversation later on this afternoon. Thank you.